Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is President of Eurasia Group, Ian Bremmer. Ian, thanks so much
Huh?
for joining me.
Absolutely. Good to be with you.
For the past month, Columbia University has garnered international attention over a pro-Palestinian encampment on the campus. You gave the commencement speech at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. So before we dive into the conversation, talk about that address. Can you talk about what the mood was like on campus?
Sure. This has been an incredibly tense couple of months. Colombia has been driving headlines across the country and even to some degree around the world. You had the police brought in twice. There were a lot of students suspended. There were students arrested, zip ties. There was, Hamilton Hall was occupied. And there was not a lot of violence, but there was certainly property damage, the sort of thing you never like to see in a university. And there's no question that this distraction, right, which was not in any way the opinion of the average Columbia student. If you were to watch the headlines, you might have thought that the average Columbia student supported Hamas, which is insane. But it was certainly true that there was an overwhelming amount of support for the Palestinians and concern about the Israeli war supported by the United States causing an awful lot of civilian damage. And that position, especially in the way it was articulated with a lot of Jewish students on the ground in Colombia, created a lot of ill will, a lot of tension, and did not reflect the learning environment. A lot of yelling, not a lot of listening on the ground in Colombia. So, it was pretty clear. When they asked me to give the speech, I was delighted. It was before any of this happened. And it was very clear to me coming into Colombia on Monday night that this was going to be a tense environment, that the feelings were running hot on campus.
Running hot, to say the least. And it's interesting, you said yes before this conflict on campus really, played out. Did your speech at all change from when you first got the ask to when it played out?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, I was going to be humorous. I was going to be entertaining.
You noted that. You said you're a funny person in your speech, but there were some funny parts, but I wouldn't categorize it as comedic.
Yeah, there were one or two little bits, sort of nods in a sense to the absurdity. But no, these were students that did not need to be entertained. These were students that needed to be challenged. They needed to be understood, they needed to be listened to, and they also needed to be, challenged. And I thought that I had an obligation to address the Middle East conflict, to address the demonstrations, to address the other conflicts around the world for the School of International and Public Affairs. It's not as if this was the only thing going on. And then also to talk about what's happening to our democracy, to our institutions, and the obligations, the opportunities, but the obligations, the responsibilities that these former students, young adults, are going to have now as they go back around the world and have jobs that should help make a difference in our society. So yeah, my speech changed an awful lot over the course of the last few weeks. And I'll be very clear. This speech could have gone very badly. Not either, for me or from anybody else that delivered it. It was very clear that this was not like an easy environment to go and speak in.
You mentioned that you thought the students needed to be understood and challenged. That's an interesting juxtaposition. Can you talk a little bit about that? Why you think they needed to be understood, but then how did you challenge them?
Well, look, there were, I stayed, of course, for the whole ceremony. And I would say about, you've got about 800, 900 graduating students there from all over the world. I'd say a solid 20% of them were wearing keffiyeh, right, in solidarity with the Palestinian cause, carrying a Palestinian flag onto the stage and displaying it, and or with a fake diploma that called for divestment from Columbia into Israel, which they handed to the dean onto the podium. So, I mean, let's be clear. You had a lot of students there that were active and wanted to use this commencement to display their feelings on this issue. And I needed those students to know that I heard them, right? That I was not going to ignore them, and that I was going to engage with them. I had to do that. But at the same time, that does not mean simply sitting and saying, okay, I hear you, and now we're going to move on. It is, what do I think? Because, I'm part of the SEPA community too, the Columbia community, and they need to hear my honest views. I don't know, I mean, if you saw the speech, that I talked about the fact that, they're all going on to their jobs and internships and fellowships and summer travel. And meanwhile, the hostages are still being held, and the Palestinians in Gaza are still facing death. And both of those things are still happening. And they need to be challenged on all of that, right? It's not like we're in this microcosm in Colombia and they fight, then they go on to the real world. It's like, okay, well, what's happening here, right? So I felt like it was really important that I showed respect to them, but then they had to actually be willing to listen and engage with me. And there were some moments at the beginning of the speech. I heard some chanting, I heard some shouting, and I said, listen, I hear you, I'm with you, I'm getting there. Give it a moment. And God bless these guys. I give them a lot of respect. They did. They were willing to listen, and not one person. Not only was there not a mass walkout, not one Columbia student left. Not one. Not one Columbia student turned their back during the speech. And at the end of the speech, I'm sure a lot of them didn't agree with everything I had to say. They all applauded. And I felt them change their minds, listen over the course of the speech. I heard from many of my students who wrote me the same thing. And I felt it, for me, it was inspiration to actually be able to be a part of that in a constructive way, in an engaged way, not in an oppositional way, which is so much of the way this has been covered in the news over the past 2 months, and is absolutely not doing any favors, not doing any service to democracy, to the students, or to the politicians on the far left and on the far right who are just using these students to make bank for themselves.
I think in your speech, too, you did a really good job of not coming across as condescending in the slightest, but B, saying, hey, this conflict has been happening now for decades, and where this conversation is entering it is not at the beginning. It has been years and years before. And on social media, you wrote this to the class, that you, quote, appreciate your passion, your respect, and your willingness to listen and engage even on the most difficult topics. When you think about the protests on campuses over the past few months, the past few weeks, especially when they've reached a boiling point, how do you think college students have been engaging?
I think that the vast majority of college students, for them, this is not their top issue. They've been asked recently in polls, some 13% think the Middle East is a top issue for the election. Far more of them talk about immigration and abortion and the economy and their loans and all of these more prosaic things than Gaza. But, all it takes is a couple of students to say something idiotic, right? I mean, to show fealty to Hamas, to say something anti-Semitic against Jews, and then you've got someone with their phone running, and they grab that clip and they promote it out there, and then you've got a whole bunch of political entrepreneurs taking advantage, in a performative way for themselves, and suddenly people think that that's what these students are all about, and that's not what these students are about at all. Look, I think that what the students are really about is that, for you and I, and me, more me than you, who spent a lot of time in the Cold War period, Israel was the underdog. Israel was the small country, the country that the Americans, the Europeans supported after the Holocaust, and never again meant that we had an obligation to make sure that an entire group of people could not be identified and killed by virtue of something they had no control over, by an accident of birth, by a cultural, a religious signifier. Never again. But young people today don't have that experience. Young people today see Israel as the most powerful country in the Middle East, militarily, offensively, and defensively, and intelligence collection, with the support of the United States and with diplomatic relations with countries in the region. They see the Palestinians as the dispossessed, as the little guy, and like many young people all over the world, they're rooting for the powerless. They're rooting for the disenfranchised. And, it's kind of like, and America does that a lot. I mean, March Madness, we all love to see that 16 seed, get into the Final Four. That excites us. And I think for a lot of the students, that's what it's about. It's about, wait a second, I thought that we were supposed to support the dispossessed. I thought, like the Statue of Liberty, I thought we're supposed to welcome those people. And suddenly, for a lot of young people, the United States doesn't look like the good guy. For a lot of young people, the United States looks like they're on the side of the villains. They're on the side of the oppressors. They're willing to support repression and death just because we happen to be allied with this one country that's friendly. Now, the reality is, like so many things in the world, that the truth is much more complicated than that. The reality is that people have given the Palestinians the short end of the stick for decades now, and not just the Americans, the Gulf states, who didn't care, who did the Abraham Accords irrespective of the fact that the Palestinians were getting nothing, right? And the fact that the Palestinians themselves had opportunities for a two-state solution, and their own government failed them. Too kleptocratic, too incapable, too unwilling to take risks. And so the Americans, after years and years of trying to be not an honest broker, because you can't be an honest broker if you're on one side, but facilitating a deal, the Americans basically said, okay, enough. Everybody said enough. And of course, that, given the state of play for what it means to be a Palestinian without any opportunities for education, any opportunities for proper health care, any opportunities to develop a life for yourself and your children, they got increasingly desperate. And people that become increasingly desperate increasingly are willing to do things that the rest of us find wholly unacceptable.
In your speech, you mention many conflicts that are unfolding worldwide, like the Russia-Ukraine war, conflicts in Sudan, as well as Haiti. But you pose this thought to the graduating class. You might ask yourselves why this particular conflict in the Middle East has so captured our attention. Do you think that is because young people in the United States, like you're saying, think that there is a very clear oppressor and the oppressed?
I think that this is one that is attached to a lot of the identities of these students to a much greater degree. It turns out, Russia, I mentioned Russia-Ukraine at the top because while these students were at Columbia, over their time, while these demonstrations were going on, the war that has led to the most hardship and death overwhelmingly is not Gaza. It's Russia-Ukraine. And not just because they're white people in Ukraine, right? But actually because the food, the fertilizer, the energy that has been disrupted has meant that the poorest people in the world, brown and black people all over the world have suffered a lot more because they're the ones, it's not just like their Happy Meal is twice as much. They can't get food, right? And so we're putting tens of millions of people into starvation because of what's happening in Russia-Ukraine. So if you really care about the whole world, you should be spending a lot more time on that. And I wasn't saying that because I'm saying, oh, you're wrong for caring about Israel-Palestine, but this is a public affairs school. Like they need to get it right. And they need to recognize that it's much more complicated. But again, in the United States, the Israel-Palestine issue is one that can be much more easily used for political gain, much more easily monetized for clicks. One that I think a lot of people, in other words, not only do young people find themselves more affiliated with one side or the other, personally connected to, but also bad actors politically and the algorithms that exaggerate them have more reason to get involved on the back of what's happening around Israel and Gaza than they do in a lot of these other issues. This is an issue that will matter for the presidential election. And that has nothing to do with peace between Israel and the Palestinians, nothing to do with the two-state solution, but a lot to do in angering people. And so I think a lot of these students needed to hear that they're being used, right, by actors that do not have their best interests at heart at all.
This is a top issue in the 2024 election. Do you think that these students, these voters, a lot of them could be first-time voters in a presidential election, do you think they are feeling disenfranchised over this?
I think that there is a danger that Biden will lose some votes. Not that they'll necessarily go to Trump, and Trump, certainly if you're pro-Palestinian, Trump's record is not supporting you. I mean, he's the guy that moved the embassy to Jerusalem. He's the guy that recognized the Golan Heights as Israeli as opposed to contested. I mean, his history is showing that the Palestinians don't matter. But I think that the decision of Biden voters to not vote, or decision of Biden voters to vote for a third party and effectively throw their vote away, is absolutely higher in the small number of swing states that will determine this 2024 election. So yes, Biden is in trouble on this issue. There's no question in my mind, and he's in trouble with young voters.
You urged this graduating class, largely of whom are Gen Z, to find a new path than the generations before us. How do you think Gen Z is different from millennials, boomers, X?
Well, they care, I think, a lot more about global issues, about issues that bring people together. Climate, which they are going to suffer from in a way that baby boomers will be long gone. They really care, and they say, wow, the people that came before us didn't really do anything about this. They look at the American fiscal environment and they see that, benefits, especially in a higher interest environment, are going to go away from Medicare and Social Security. Wow, you guys really didn't take care of us, and you're still kicking it down the road. You're not willing to actually do anything. And so I think that this is a generation that feels much more skeptical, that in some ways feels very cynical about their leaders, and that feels that their institutions are not functioning well. And I spent a lot of time talking about the fact that these institutions are being damaged, that they're gardens, and these are gardens that need to be continually treated with hard effort and care, and that the leaders that they have, their political leaders, their elites, have fallen down on the job. And that if they want to have a world that they can be more proud of, they're going to need to put more effort into building these civic institutions. This is going to be a priority in the United States and around the world. And I think, not being willing to recognize that would come across as wholly disingenuous on my part. I'm not proud of the fact that we've gone from a world where the Americans were the leading democratic light to a country where the U.S. is still the most powerful, but no one would look to the United States as, I want to run my country like that. I wish my political institutions were like that. I wish my elections were run like that. No one would say that. In just 30 years, since I got my PhD, we've gone from people around the world really looked up to American democracy to no one around the world does that anymore. I think for me to tell the students, oh, you have all these opportunities, go forth and multiply, and not tell them, hey, this has gone badly under my generation, and take responsibility for it, then they have every right to walk out on me. They should. If I'm not going to be honest with them, I have no right to challenge them. None. I lose my ability I lose my authority. And I think that with young people, with smart young people, you need to establish your credentials by being authentic, honest, and credible. You've got to start with that. Those are table stakes.
I mean, you're sounding the alarm here, but I did think that your speech really had a hopeful tone.
Absolutely.
You left us with a sentiment that although we can't change the world really in a day or a week, we can move to get there. What is the solution? Because you talk about this information warfare. You talk about young students, young people being used for the upcoming election. What's the solution?
Well, the solution, and I am very hopeful. I mean, look, if I can give that speech in the middle of Colombia, in the middle of the worst violence we've seen since 1968, I wasn't even born. If I can do that and the students can all applaud, then those students who are in the position I was in 30 years ago, they can do that. They can collectively, individually and collectively, be the solution that we need. They can be more authentic. They can reject cynicism. They can engage with people they don't agree with. They can respect them. They can listen. They can allow themselves to be challenged. And as I said at the end, they can take their work seriously, but not take themselves seriously, right? I thought the most important thing they need to really digest is the fact that their work and their lives, their careers are not about principles and ideology. They're not about these abstract fights of left versus right. It's much more simple than that. It's about people. It's about people. It's about helping people. It's about doing work that treats fellow human beings as deserving of respect and time and care and decency. That's what has been missing in the way we have talked about this debate. I mean, the Jewish students, Muslim students, it's not about their ideologies. They're students. They're students that are in our care. They're students that they're not fully fledged human beings yet, and they're getting their degrees and they're trying ideas out. And we have a burden of helping them to be constructive and productive and make a difference. And the way you do that is to teach them how to treat their fellow human beings like fellow human beings. And they are capable of doing that. If they're capable of all doing that with me, delivering some messages that they clearly didn't want to hear, they're obviously capable of doing that with their peers who are much cooler than me, right? Who listen to the same music, who hang out at the same bars, right? I don't know any of that stuff. So they're clearly, of course it's upbeat. Of course it's upbeat.
What do you think is missing from the national dialogue when it comes to this topic? Because, as you know, Colombia has been in the spotlight for a month now. The conflict in Gaza, as well as Ukraine, around the world continues. What's missing?
What's missing is that this is all the real human interaction is getting drowned out by the headlines. The media headlines, the social media headlines, the money behind those media and social media headlines, the political election that is driving the money behind those media and social media headlines. I mean, that's it. Look, before I gave my speech, Jerry Seinfeld gave his speech at Duke. And, they also had, a whole bunch of students that were saying, we've got to protest, we've got to walk out. I saw what happened. 30 students walked out. Okay, 30. In the middle of Jewish Jerry Seinfeld, who, has taken photos with the IDF and has definitely been on one side politically of this fight. 30 students, that was it. He gave a respectful, upbeat, funny speech, and the vast majority of the students were there chanting his name, applauding for him, and yet the story all weekend was, all of this disruption at Duke. Not true. Completely not true. But that story does not benefit all of the actors on the extremes who are the ones that want to drive this conversation. And that's the problem. That's what's missing. And that's why I'm here talking with you today, because I know the reality is absolutely not what's been in the headlines. And we need to do a better job for the students who are our future. We need to take more responsibility for that.
Well, you beat Jerry Seinfeld because you had 0 students walk out in your speech.
At Columbia. I think that's a big deal. God bless these students. I tell you, I thought they were wonderful.
So do you think the media is really missing the nuance of this story and of this conflict?
Oh my God, do I think it? Of course I think it. It's overwhelming. I mean, it is not exciting. The media is mostly not a thoughtful 30-minute conversation that you and I are having right now. The media is mostly a 3-minute, a 4-minute soundbite, and it's not even that. It's the headline that people frequently don't even click through that is supposed to be what is the condensed version of that 3 to 4 minutes, but it's always the most heated, most salacious bit of that 3 and 4 minutes, which is then algorithmically promoted. It's horrible. So yeah, if you're watching the media, you are not understanding what's happening in the campuses. We at my firm, G0 Media, we had student reporters down there at Columbia for a couple weeks putting information out for our followers, and it was like you were talking about a different planet. It wasn't at all what was being covered in the media.
Well, Ian Bremmer, I appreciate your time. I appreciate the nuanced conversation. Thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.